There is a story of a man whose ancestors traveled from what we now know as Africa into Europe. In the spring, about 18,700 years ago, he came to Isturiz, planning only to exchange some new tools, but found himself meeting a woman who would become his mate. She had a shorter, sturdier build and an oval-shaped skull that he found strikingly beautiful. She always carried with her a small woman figurine. He was tall, part of a well-known hunting group, and a skilled engraver of bone. His favorite meat was reindeer, the rich, warm flavor that marked the coming of winter. Known for her strong teeth that helped her soften animal skins, she was popular among the group. Good with the flute, good with children, and willing to help in the hunt when needed. Both were descendants of the Cro-Magnon, part of the Magdalenian people who followed reindeer and other game across the Ice Age plains. They would sit together by the fire, singing with the others. She bore at least 7 children, but then a fierce winter blew her life away. They buried her with ornaments, covering her body in red ochre. The burial took place during the day. That night, the group sat by the fire at the mouth of a cave where a great bison-shaped rock, curving as it would embrace that group of men, women, and children as its own. Her flute lay silent beside them as the firelight flickered across their faces, revealing the shifting planes and depths of the human face, haunted by the thought, what is this thing inside me? The one that dreams, that fears, that remembers. When spring returned and the group moved north again, he stopped at Gargas, across the Pyrenees. There, in the half-light of the cave, he pressed his hand to the wall and blew pigment around it, leaving a red stencil, a trace of her and of himself. It was his way of remembering, of saying that they had been, that love and imagination had existed. And that memory, somehow, could live on in stone. That first flicker of what we'd now call the awareness of awareness.
And that story is our story.
Welcome to CC, the podcast where you see what others see.
Hi there. Good morning. So today, what are we talking about? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Sassy here. Is anyone there? Hi, my name is Sassy. I'm based in Berlin, and I want to welcome you to CC, the podcast where you see what others see. This season is all about the mind. And today I feel honored to share the microphone with Domingo Milela, a fellow guest of the season Mind and one of the most profound voices in contemporary photography, whose lens has the ability to turn ancient caves, cities, and landscapes into living memories. Good morning, Domingo. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. Ceci, today we'll travel back in time hundreds of thousands of years into human history, all the way to the Ice Age. We will ask questions like how was life back then and what traces can be found in ancient caves. We'll talk about human consciousness, sensitivity and imagination. We will stand face to face with our ancestors.
And for that, guess with whom we'll be talking.
Our guests today are Paul Bahn and Elle Clifford. Dr. Paul Bahn is one of the world's foremost authorities on prehistoric art and archaeology. He earned his PhD at the University of Cambridge, is a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, a corresponding member of the Archaeological Institute of America, and he belongs to leading organizations such as the Prehistoric Society and the Société Préhistorique Française. Beyond academia, he's brought archaeology to global audiences, serving as a consultant on the BBC's The Making of Mankind, advising WGBH's Nova Human Origins, and most recently, guiding viewers through How Art Began with Anthony Gormley. He also appeared in the first episode of Kunk on Earth, sharing his insights on early humans and cave art. His many books include Images of the Ice Age, The Cambridge Illustrated History of Prehistoric Art, and Cave Art, a guide to the decorated Ice Age caves of Europe, along with broader works such as The Cambridge Illustrated History of Archaeology, Archaeology, Theories, Methods and Practice, and The Penguin Archaeology Guide, and Everyday Life in the Ice Age, co-authored with our other guest today, psychologist, researcher and lecturer, Elle Clifford. Elle holds a Master of Science in Psychology and Prehistory from Hull and York Universities. She's accompanied Dr. Bahn on more than 50 visits to decorated caves, where her expertise has brought fresh perspective. Her contributions help us understand how people of the Ice Age lived, loved, and raised families, adding a vital human depth to the archaeological record. Together, Bahn and Clifford have also written books for children, reflecting their passion for education and for keeping alive the understanding of our long and complex ancestry. Whether in print or on screen, their collaborations do more than document prehistory. They invite us to see our ancestors across 40,000 years, not as distant strangers, but as mirrors. In their art, their stories, and their lives, we glimpse our own. A reminder that even across the millennia, the human experience remains deeply connected, and that we are never far from those who came before us.
The legend Paul Bahn and the incredible Elle Clifford together in Berlin. What a treat. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting us.
It's a pleasure.
Miss Clifford, to begin our conversation, we'd love for you to help us all, Domingo, me, and of course our listeners, situate ourselves in the Ice Age and clear up some of the common myths about the people who lived then, how they looked, how long they lived, and what were the main causes of death.
Of course, we're talking about a very long period of time, at least 30,000 years, and the people that lived in the Ice Age were scaffolding their behaviour on ancestors that lived a long time before them. What did they look like? Well, people who lived in the Ice Age were about the same size as us. The women, from the remains that we have, the women were between 5'2" and 5'4", and the men were on average 5'9", but some of them were 6 foot. There's a lot of variation with humans now, and there certainly would have been then. But how do we know what they possibly looked like? Well, we have different ways of finding that out. We can take casts of their skulls from the few burials that we have. And, for example, we know that one of the boys that was buried in Sungir about maybe 28,000 years ago, we know from his skull cast that he had an overshot jaw, which would have made eating meat very difficult. So you ask yourself, how did he survive? We also know that he had no lack of protein in his bones. So he must have been getting his protein from some other form, which probably was snails and insects and worms, which, let's face it, take a long time to collect every day. We also have another means of understanding what their appearance was like, the little tiny figurines that we've found, which seem to be ubiquitous in Europe. We haven't got that many, but the ones we have are very revealing about what people look like. We can't always trust them. They're female figurines for the most part. Some of the women appear very corpulent, and we think that's rather unlikely that people were mobile people, actually carried extra weight. So we can look at the little figurines. Sometimes, they're intricately engraved and they're wearing clothes. So we some have an idea about their hairstyles, their appearance, what they were wearing. And then the other method is looking at plaquettes that we've found in Lamache. They're engraved. There are several hundred of them, but most of them are of animals. A few of them are of people. And I think when you see those, you're kind of blown away by how our ancestors portrayed other ancestors, the people that they knew, because there's a whole range of how they looked. So we have the remains in burials, which we can make estimations about. We have these little figurines that appear all over Russia, Siberia, in Central Europe, and we also have the plaquettes. So you don't see either paintings or drawings of humans very often. It's not something that preoccupied our ancestors during the Ice Age. Sometimes we see tantalizing little images of anthropomorphs, what we call anthropomorph, which look partly human, but we don't really know what's in their mind when they're painting or drawing that sort of figurine. So how long did they live? We have the remains of humans that lived at least 45 years. Once they get to 45, they could have been 60. It's very difficult to tell. So they had the potential to live quite long lives. But these were difficult times. We're moving on to what were the causes of death. Sometimes life was quite easy, we assume, because the climate was quite nice. And of course, it all depended where they lived. I would assume that living around the Gulf of Genoa 30,000 years ago was somewhat easier than living in the north of Siberia, and we know our ancestors were there. But, it was a tough life, and presumably there were all sorts of things that could have endangered their lives, so it's very difficult to know how long they lived. And the few burials that we have, deliberate burials, are less than probably 200. And we only have about 800 remains for our ancestors spanning the whole of that period. And they are scattered. But from the human remains that are deliberately buried, we can find out, scientists have found out a tremendous amount about the causes of their deaths.
What I've read in your book was that by wearing these animal skins, there was a lot of bacteria and microbes and this kind of negative symbiosis with these kinds of beings that were a big cause of death.
Yeah, all the most likely, from drowning to being on fire to, they've got open fires in these rock shelters. So accidents. We know that people did break bones, but they lived with the consequences. But yes, if you are killing animals, you are gutting animals, you're butchering them, and you're processing their animal skins, there are inherent dangers with that. Anything could get into your bloodstream. Another one of the little boys that was from Sungir, he had a fungal infection. If that had got into his bloodstream, which it was likely, then you get sepsis. Wearing skins would have been... they would have had body lice, they would have had, all sorts of things to deal with. And very interestingly, I read recently, Siberia is covered by about 60% of permafrost, and that is melting with global warming. And all sorts of things are being uncovered. We're getting, baby mammoths and early dogs' remains, which are absolutely fascinating. But the other thing that's happening is these very ancient bacteria and viruses are also coming to the surface. And recently there was a problem with reindeer herders getting anthrax that had come from, remains that had been buried for thousands of years. So potentially, it's a horrible thought. It's almost science fiction, isn't it, that these ancient viruses are going to be a danger to us, but we're learning more about the possible problems that these early ancestors encountered in their lives and shortened their lives.
I love this idea of the ecosystem you are caressing. As if to have this imagination of deep time, we need to see it as ecosystem. And there is a prehistoric present from what you say. And I also love this idea of the contemporary prehistoric presence. When we think about people in the Ice Age, it's easy to imagine small bands of humans scattered across vast frozen landscapes. But behind that image lies an incredible story of organization and cooperation, the kind of collaboration that made survival possible. These early communities had to balance mobility, resource sharing, social structure, all while adapting to an unpredictable environment. So, I'd like to ask, how many men typically hunted together, and how large were the groups that moved according to the availability of game? How big was the overall population during that time?
It's very difficult to figure out how many people there were in any particular group in the last Ice Age or in Europe or Eurasia as a whole. All we can go on really is the size of present-day hunter-gatherer groups, and on the whole they tend to be in groups of about 25 to 35. And that does seem to fit in with some of the prehistoric evidence we have, such as a reindeer hunting site at Perceval in France, where the number of tents and so on, and the number of people they could contain does seem to indicate that that is the sort of figure that we can deal with. Now, each group of 25 to 35 people is going to need a pretty wide area to exploit to be able to extract the resources from it. So that leads on to the next problem, which is utterly unresolved, which is population sizes in any part of Europe or in the whole of Eurasia during the last Ice Age. We simply don't know. There have been many, many studies, many claims, ranging from a few hundred people, say, in Cantabria, to tens of thousands of people in Spain as a whole. Basically, we just don't know, because we don't know how many of the sites that have been discovered, and we don't know what percentage of sites have been discovered. We don't know how many of them have been truly contemporaneous. People have tried to work out carrying capacity of the environment. They've tried to do all kinds of statistical studies. Basically, it's just guesswork. I would say it's fake news. Anytime you see a population estimate for any part of Europe and any part of the Ice Age, it's purely guesswork. We simply don't know.
Some of the larger sites, like Dolní Věstonice in Pavlov, we know that huge numbers of people accumulated for many months through the hunting season. They were huge communities that were here for quite a long period of time, quite a settled time. They were living in tents, living in man-made structures, and exchanging ideas, finding new partners, exchanging material goods, showing people what they'd made. As they are learning new skills, the culture is being pushed forward.
I think another important point to mention is that we're talking about a huge expanse of territory from, say, southern Spain all the way through to northern Siberia, 40,000 years. It's not a monolithic entity. There are enormous ranges of environments and topographies there. Plus, over those 40,000 years, the climate changed regularly, cold phases, warm phases. So nothing is uniform over that area, over that span of time, which makes it even more impossible to figure out population sizes in any part of Europe or in that whole area.
Mm-hmm. And what about the roles of men and women? Were they clearly defined? Were they more fluid? Have you been able to find out something about that?
Well, you have hunter-gatherers living today as a good model, and also information from ethnographers and anthropologists in the past who lived with people and found out about their way of life. They just have a different reality to us. They shared a different reality, which was to do with living, being embedded and living in that landscape. I sort of kind of tell children that they wore the landscape like a big cape around themselves. They were underneath it. They were in it. They perhaps didn't see themselves as being a human like we do, as individuals. It was collective. Well, let's just mention some of the jobs that they have to do, and perhaps the listener will decide who would be best suited to doing some of these jobs. big part of their lives was butchering and skinning animals. I think we worked out that every 5 days they needed to kill a reindeer to feed a family of 7. Nothing would be wasted. Nothing is with hunter-gatherers. They recycle everything. Once your clothing's worn out, you use it for something else. So they butcher and skin animals, process skins and furs for clothing. Very important, especially if you're living in Siberia. Netting animals, fishing and gutting, collecting wood would be so essential to their survival. You cannot underestimate it. And it's not something that's often thought about. They needed wood for lighting, for fires, for cooking. Absolutely essential. So if they move from one place to another, it's perhaps because they've run out of wood. And the landscape didn't look nothing like it does today. There is no part of the world today that is anything like the Ice Age. And it would not be heavily forested. There were trees and shrubs, but it would not be heavily forested like it is now. Keeping the fires going, gathering seasonal foods, collecting water, processing foods for stuff. I could go on. Making tools from stone, bone, antler, making beads and jewellery. We know they did that. Teaching children all they need to know to survive for the future. This is a huge job. And of course, we know from hunter-gatherer children that they learn by osmosis with their older siblings and with their parents. They're actually with them all the time. They're encouraged to play, act out what the adults are doing. Gender politics would have been an issue then. But I think they would have done what is the most sensible thing to get your children to adulthood, because it would have been a very difficult task. You have 13 million calories to get a child to 18. That's a lot of food to find. So it's a big investment having children. And we know that hunter-gatherers usually only have about 2 to 3 children, because that makes sense. They've worked it out. That's the most likely way of all of them being successful.
I see a lot of parallels with today's times. And something I found really fascinating about these early communities is that despite the challenges they faced, they don't seem to have been especially violent. The archaeological record suggests a kind of social harmony that challenges our modern assumptions. It almost seems that violence, in a way, was something that developed later as culture became more complex. Is that correct, Dr. Ban?
As far as we can tell, that is correct. Yes, we have very, very little evidence for violence in the last Ice Age. We have a couple of female skeletons in Italy, actually, with flints embedded in their backbones or something like that, and I think one child. But when you think you're talking about 40,000 years and how many thousands of people there must have been, and even the few hundred burials or human remains that we have, it's absolutely minimal. So as far as we can tell, it is sort of the golden age, if you like, of humanity. And it's really only when we settle down and farm and start accumulating possessions, that's when violence and raiding and all that kind of thing arises. As far as we can tell, life in the last Ice Age was just not violent.
Cooperation would have been the most... I think you mentioned that earlier, Domingo. Cooperation would be the secret to their success.
And survival.
And even these few examples I said of backbones, they could be hunting accidents.
Absolutely.
We don't know that they are deliberate violence.
Exactly. Something else I was reflecting on was about their incredible sense of direction and memory, both vital for survival, especially during hunting and seasonal gatherings. And it reminded me a bit of elephant families who rely on their extraordinary memory to navigate vast landscapes and find resources. And it's striking to think that today's technology, which is supposedly built to connect us, so often leave us feeling the opposite, absent and disconnected. And social media, for example, has been shown to weaken our memory and shorten our attention span.
Well, that's more than an evidence, is a sort of fact that technology creates a different sense of self. And this relates to what we will carry in the future. I have this very strong gut feeling as an artist. How do you feel about this, Mrs. Clifford?
I think we have become heavily dependent. For about 5,000 years, we've developed various ways of storing information externally outside of our heads. And it's led to us perhaps being lazy without even realising it. We don't use our brains in the same way that our early ancestors would have done, because they probably had some means of capturing information in portable art. But really, they had to remember everything, and they had to remember everything and pass that information on, a huge volume of information. And they have all sorts of techniques for doing that. We know this from living hunter-gatherers. And it's wrapped up in their stories, narratives, their myths, their poems, their songs, their dances. Anything they can use to pass that information on, they will. And you could actually argue that the last few thousand years, we've kind of been dumbing down, relying heavily on technology. I mean, how many people today can find their way about without looking at Google Maps?
Yeah, I think it has to do also with the cognitive capacities that the senses provide. Like if you were in the Ice Age, you would have to taste, you would have to smell, you have to experience.
Absolutely.
And for us, like looking into the telephone is just one of the other, and it's not an experience. It's just an image shooting.
Yeah, absolutely,
right?
Absolutely, Cece. All of their senses would be heightened, but that's how they should be. I would argue, all of their senses would be heightened. Their sense of smell would be better. Probably their sight would be better. I mean, we've been climbing in caves with, artificial lighting, moving in the same places where our early ancestors moved with very little lighting. How would they do that? We've asked ourselves time and again, how would they be able to do that? Because you would need both hands to climb 150 feet. We do it with all sorts of climbing rigging, but they did it without. We know they had little ladders. We know they had ropes. But somebody has to do it first. Somebody has to find their way in these enormous spaces. And it's funny, once you get tuned into it, you pick up things that you didn't think you would have done. So when there's a big open space, a big cavern in a cave, you kind of sense the hairs on the back of your neck stand up and you think, something's changed about the atmosphere here. I know I'm coming to a slightly different area than I've been for. And then you're on alert. I mean, we know we're safe, but they went into these caves exploring. And without all the, facilities that we have.
In fact, I think about imagination, because all what we are saying comes back to a primal faculty of humanity, which is the capability to see things you cannot see. And this idea of the digital age and what we're doing with AI compared to what they were doing in the caverns has a deep affinity in my own sensibility. I might be wrong, but I feel that there is this strange connection between being able to imagine, to remember, and to tell, and being able to process the world and the ecosystem and the connections that are rooted in us. Well, among the many aspects that will be touched across the episodes of this season Mind, there are the risks and rewards that come with new technologies, like, as I said, artificial intelligence, that will definitely transform the human mind and the meaning of what it is to be human. And of course, the first groundbreaking technology to do that was fire. When humans learned to control and use fire to cook, to stay warm, to protect themselves, it changed everything. Our bodies, the way we digest food, all started to shift, opening the door for bigger brains and eventually culture itself. Dr. Bunn, in your recent work, Everyday Life in the Ice Age, you explore how early humans mastered fire, from the lamps they used to changes in cooking practices, to the mix of benefits and risks this first great technology brought. I would like to hear what you both think about how fire changed us, biologically, technologically, and socially.
Well, we're not quite sure when fire was first mastered by humans. We think it goes back more than 1 million years. But that being so, by the time we get to the last ice age, they clearly had total mastery of fire. And it will have had enormous changes for human life in every way, as you say. Heat, light, the ability to cook, the ability to change particular materials, such as the color of pigments or the hardness of stone that they were working. And, of course, it helps to keep predators at bay. So there are many, many wonderful advantages to fire. Why didn't we think of this before? But having taken on fire, of course, there are inevitably hazards to it. Ellie has already mentioned the possibility of children falling into it or people getting burned and so on. And then, of course, always the threat of damage from soot and so on getting into the human body, which would be why they didn't very often light fires deep inside caves. They only had them in rock shelters and in the open air, inevitably. So there are some downsides to fire, but not too many, I would say. It was one of our great steps forward.
However, one of the downsides, of course, is it's carcinogenic. And so possibly that's why they lived in rock shelters or in the open air rather than deep in caves, because, you could get rid of the smokies. If the wind changes and blows in the wrong direction, you're covered in the stuff and you're breathing it in. So that's one of the causes of death that we may have seen. They may have got cancer. Also, TB's been around for about 70,000 years. And it's thought that when we started gathering round fires at night, and they would have spent many, many hours around the fire, they would have kept the fires going all the time. They would have been continuous. So it may have been that we were gathering closely round a fire, and certain things like TB could have been a potential problem.
Interesting. And of course, you can almost imagine those first communities sitting together around the fire, sharing stories, passing on knowledge at the verge of the flames, and creating meaning. I think fire didn't just change how humans lived, it also changed how they saw. Light extended perception beyond daylight, revealing shapes and shadows and movement in entirely new ways. In the caves, that flickering light must have transformed walls into living surfaces, helping early humans project images and stories and perhaps even other dimensions of perceptions. And I'm thinking about the lamps they used to go inside. Ms. Clifford, regarding the essential role that storytelling played in early societies, how did gathering around the fire-shaped communication, memory, we've been talking a little bit already about that, but I would like to go a little bit deeper in the beginning of let's say, myth and oral tradition among Ice Age people, and what does the artistic expression tell us about this?
I don't think we can underestimate the value of it. I think it's hugely important, that collectivity of thought. It's the essence of human reality. So they have to all agree on the same reality. The same social rules, they have to feel that they belong, they bond together. And so sharing stories about their ancestry, sharing all sorts of exciting stories, it's about who you are. It's about where you've come from. And how did they motivate each other to keep going under very often these circumstances they lived in were really difficult. They must have had anxieties about food all of the time. When you think of the mental health problems that we have today, that we see, you wonder how these people living in very, very arduous circumstances were able to keep themselves thinking it was worth it. And
to find meaning.
To find meaning in life. And this would have been the meaning in life. This would have been so important, passing these stories on. Because they would have been beginning stories as well. Because all children say, where have we come from? And trying to explain some of the wonders of the world.
And they provide also for these different dimensions of perception, I think, and allow the imagination to expand. Just to think about this lighting in the caves and how they project the rocks and the expressions of art. They allow you to expand the way you perceive the world. And well, up next, we will hear you, Domingo, accompanied by the music of another fellow guest of the Season Mind, who the New York Times described as a social conscious, multimedia collaborator, system builder, rhapsodist, historical thinker, and multicultural gateway, B.J. Ayer. He's a composer, pianist, and band leader, as well as the Franklin D. and Florence Rosenblatt Professor of the Art at Harvard University. This is B.J. Ayer trio song Prelude Orison from their album Compassion. Mr. Ayer plays the piano, Linda Mahon plays the double bass, and Toyshin Sore plays the drums. And as I've said, their music will accompany you, Domingo, as you talk about the world of imagination and dreams inside the cave.
And this tenderness and the way the cave becomes a scary place at the beginning and then a place where you find your own corner, your own comfort, your own heartbeat, your own breath, and also your own vision. Because the cave is also a place where there is no disturbances of any kind and vision can be enhanced. And so it brings clarity to the images that are inside. And I am quite sure, even though this is very hard to demonstrate scientifically, that the world of dreams and the world of imagination, for me and for prehistoric men as human beings, must have been a presence in the depth of the mountain and inside the cave, because there is intimacy in these places. It's not just a sort of strange and absurd event that humanity went to look for his own earliest form of symbolic thinking, something we could call religion, something we could call art, because in reality we don't have the words to describe these things. Dr. Ban, could you talk a bit about the aesthetic of the caves? Those imaginary scenes lit only by the dim glow of fire. What kind of sensory or emotional experience do you think that created for the people that ventured inside these hollow spaces?
I think there must have been overwhelming feelings as they went into these caves. Firstly, the actual environment of the cave is utterly unlike anything in the outside world. So it's a special world with all kinds of strange shapes and formations. And then to see images on the walls or ceiling of these spaces must have been utterly remarkable to them. And of course, the correct way to see any cave art today is with very dim light and preferably a flickering flame, because those are the conditions in which they were made. You should never visit a decorated cave with static electric light. Sadly, that's the way we have to do it most of the time these days. But interestingly, a number of the caves that you can still visit are now doing special visits with flickering lights, because those are the ideal conditions to see the art. And it is remarkable when you see the art, because the flickering light really does make the images seem to move. It brings them to life. Many people have written over the years about this is like the first cinema, the first comic strips, certainly the first cinema. And it's absolutely true, and it's very moving to see these images seem to come to life on the wall in front of you. So this must have had a tremendous impact on the people of those days.
And we think that was intentional. Sometimes there's a real staging. Particular places have been chosen to place the art, and it looks as if it's part of an experience they've shared. Huge, great big coverings of the wall with scenes, and often the scene is placed somewhere where the acoustics are particularly special, like the sound of an underground river. Ever so often you're looking at the frieze of horses in Tito Bustillo, and when the river runs through, it sounds like the horses are moving over the landscape. It's beautiful.
There is something which is hard to put in words, but it's as if you go into a small hall to enter a larger universe. And this unique darkness of the cave space must have been also very peculiar, as you said, Dr. Clifford, because the exterior world must have been brighter, always, even at night, for a starry sky and the moon and the snow or the open spaces compared to the pure darkness of the cave. So this purity of darkness is something I think quite large in our psyche. But caves are special places. They hold both mystery and comfort, the known and the unknown. Like us, Ice Age people shared their surroundings through art, turning stone walls into spaces of meaning. Each cave has its own spirit, with bison, reindeer, mammoths, and horses that once shared the landscape with our ancestors. Let's listen to our fellow guest in this season, celebrated British choreographer Alexander Whitley, famous for pushing dance into the digital age, using technology not as a decoration, but as a powerful critique of how it reshapes our bodies, our attention, our humanity, reflecting on how people in the Ice Age created the shared symbols and atmospheres in the caves.
it is a very fundamental, primordial human need. The construction of atmospheres and effective spaces that shift our perception and sense of reality can be so transformative. It's amazing to think about how far back that extends. I mean, theatres are modern caves. We've made modern versions of these things that have existed and played a really significant role in human civilization from very, very early on. I can't speak with any authority on this, but I've read enough to be fascinated by, the significance of caves and the subterranean world in early human experiences in providing a different insight into shifting reality. These things endure and carry on, and I think dance is a powerful way of connecting with these primordial elements of our existence, of shifting frame of knowledge and meaning making, of connecting with something that extends really far back into human history. Especially nowadays, where in modern culture there is such a strong influence of the kind of linguistic and abstract rational meaning making. Having the opportunity to connect with other forms of meaning and forms of perception are really powerful. And I think they're only going to become more significant and powerful the more mediated our experiences become by technology. And I know that probably sounds strange as an artist that works so much with technology, but it's precisely in that tension again of considering how our experiences are shaped by the elements around us and how they can be worked with and explored and understood through their live, in-person, collective experience of being together in dark spaces and having the space be transformed through shifts in light and sound and color and texture and movement and dynamics. They are powerful and they do something really, really important for us. Precisely so powerful in that we can't say exactly what they are.
I mentioned dream in my recordings. Miss Clifford, how do you see this crazy metaphor I have in my mind?
It's possible. What would they have made of dreams? I mean, even we don't really understand why, but, they must have been magical. I know there's one hunter-gatherer group that once women have partnered with a male, they don't understand what conception's all about. The females think they have to dream first that they're having a baby before they get pregnant. Which is beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But I'd like to just describe one of my own experiences, and there have been many in these caves because I've been to 50 decorated caves with Paul. To tap into what I think you're talking to, I'll talk about the Anthropomorph Sanctuary in Tito Bustillo. Have you been in Tito Bustillo?
Yes.
You have. You may have been in this small gallery. You go off the main walk and it's a little passageway. It was only discovered maybe 20, 25 years ago. Tito was discovered in 1968, but this wasn't found because it is hidden away. And so you go down a very narrow passageway and then you come to a wall that was built during the Paleolithic. So these people built a little wall in front of the entrance. So that tells you something interesting. Someone's not allowed. Certain people are not allowed. This is a
architecture.
Special. Yes, exactly. So then it's a very arduous climb upwards, what we call a chimney, and different ledges. So there were 3 of us, and a little wooden ladder has to be handed down for you to put it up against the wall so you can get up this chimney. So you're squeezed into a space. You're hot. You're losing your normal, senses of what you can pin everything to because you're just surrounded by clay walls. Eventually, you drop into an area which is quite small, but the topography of the place is very unusual. So this has been chosen particularly by our ancestors for something. So it's a sort of a rounded area, which is quite unusual. And the only real thing of interest in there is a flag stalactite which hangs down. It's about 3 meters from the ground and it hangs down with firelight. And there is a fire there that dates back to 38,000 years. And when that's lit, this translucent flag lights up, shimmering. On one side is an outline in red ochre, red paint, of a male, and on the other side is a female. You know, very sort of sketchy, but it's pretty clear what it is because the male has a penis. And the other interesting thing is that there is a little protrusion out of the wall that has been man-made that you can actually sit on and look up, stare up at this. I mean, we talk about a sanctuary meaning a devotional space, but I couldn't think of another word to describe it. The feeling, the intense emotion that you feel when you're in this particular place is overwhelming. And I wouldn't swap that experience with going on a spaceship to the moon.
Did you cry?
Oh, yes, I did. Of course I did, yeah. Did you cry, Paul?
No, I'm afraid not.
I have cried. I've cried in front of the first clear vision of the very large vertical bison at the entrance of El Castillo, when you don't recognize the animal, but after you follow the line and you see that the rock has the back part of the animal, and there is this movement of this enormous, it's probably 2.50 meters, 3 meters long. I mean, it's
one of my favorites, yeah.
I cried. The first time I could see the animal emerge. I just was on my knees.
They've been deliberately doing this in many, many caves, you know, the features that might almost hint at animals. And of course we are humans that recognise patterns, and it would have been a good survival tactic if you could recognise the part of an animal before you saw the whole thing. So that our brains are almost, you know, set up for this, seeing things that might be a particular thing. So when they've gone into caves, when they've first gone into these caves, we think they've looked for particular shapes on the wall and then they've enhanced them. Very often, these figures that they painted are around cracks or fissures or openings. We see this. Once you start noticing this, then you see it more and more and more in the different caves. And that might be part of a mythology. You know, if they're trying to explain where did we come from, I mean, did we come from under the ground? Did we come from these caves and caverns? Was that our origin story? Did we all come out of these cracks together? I mean, it's just an idea.
Talk about the darkness and the womb. Dr. Bell, we are so used to talk a lot about paintings and these engravings, and they are of such importance, I believe, for all, as we were mentioning, regarding the subtle ways in which light exposes or hides them.
Yeah, they are invisible, the engravings. That's the interesting thing.
Sometimes, yes.
And sometimes are hidden in chambers when you need to go down. Like in El Castillo again, there is some very small deers hidden. You need to sort of squeeze under a hole, look back upwards, twist your whole spine to see this very small, beautiful deer. But if the light goes away or it's pointed in a different direction, the deer disappears in the rock again. It's a secret. Light and shadow, secret.
And is that why we do not see them so often on books, Dr. Ben?
It's true, engravings are actually far more numerous in cave art than paintings, but they're far less photogenic, so you don't tend to see them very much in books. Lascaux, for example, has several hundred paintings, but more than 1,000 engravings. There are so many engravings. So that's one point to make. The second point, as Domingo has already suggested, is when they made the original engravings, they couldn't have the light shining straight onto the wall because then the shadow of your hand would hide what you're doing. So you have to have the light at one side or the other. And this means that in many of the engravings, the fine engravings that you get in the caves, if you shine the light straight onto the wall, you see nothing. But if you tilt it to one side or the other, suddenly, boom, there magically an image appears. And they very probably played with this effect. It was well known to them. There are, of course, many engravings that are very clear. When you shine the light straight onto them, they're big, broad lines. But the vast majority of engravings, you need this oblique lighting, which does make them secret in many ways. In some of the places they put them, you have to go looking for them. And interestingly enough, the same thing occurs to engravings in the open air. In some of the open air sites, like in the Coa Valley in Portugal, the early figures were pecked into the rock, so they're very visible from a distance. But the later images from the end of the Ice Age are very fine engravings, which are often very small, and you have to go looking for them. You can't see them from a distance.
And talking about these petroglyphs, which is a very interesting aspect of the generic, universe of Ice Age art, These open air, well, we said the word sanctuary, but these open air sites, let's stay more modest. So these open air sites. Dr. Ban, could you tell us more about open air art and portable art? Where has it mostly been found, and what was its significance in the Ice Age?
Well, portable art was the first category of art that was ever known from the Ice Age. They started finding bits even in the 1820s and then especially the 1860s onwards. So we have thousands of pieces of portable art on stone, bone, ivory, antler, and it covers the whole area from southern Spain all the way through to Siberia. And of course, it tells us a great deal about the animals around at the time, the techniques of studying them, and all this kind of thing. From the beginning of the discovery of cave art, which you're talking about the end of the 19th century, the people studying cave art always assumed that there must have been art in the open air as well on rocks, but they thought it couldn't possibly have survived since the last Ice Age. But now we know since the 1980s that given the right circumstances and microclimates, it can indeed survive. Paintings do not, of course. Pigment disappears very rapidly in the open air, but figures that are pecked or engraved into rocks, particularly schist rocks for some reason, can and do survive. And so we now have a huge quantity just in northeast Portugal in the Coa Valley. We have 20 kilometers of this material, and other parts of neighboring parts of Spain. We also have some in Germany and in Egypt now. So for most of us, actually, we've now grown accustomed to the idea that cave art is actually a very rare and somewhat marginal phenomenon in the last Ice Age. It just happens to have survived. But the vast majority of the art they produced must have been in the open air. And of course, we assume most of the portable art they produced was done in the open air as well. But as far as the petroglyphs in the open air, we assume they must have been everywhere. Most have disappeared, but what we have is still pretty substantial. And it's very much similar to what you have in the caves, the same limited range of animals, mostly in profile adult animals, very few scenes, no landscapes, a few geometric signs, one or two humans. It fits exactly with what we have in the caves. And of course, you have phenomena similar in the caves, such as if you have an open-air panel of petroglyphs, the trajectory of the sun during that day will change the lighting, the visibility of that panel. And of course, at night, they probably had fires lit in the vicinity of some of these panels. So again, you had the flickering effect on the open-air art. So it's still very much a part of the same phenomenon as cave art, but actually it is the norm. We think the open-air art is the norm. The caves are a rare and somewhat marginal, very special phenomenon.
This is very interesting. I was in Foz Szkoła for the first time 2 months ago. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that visiting the engravings at night, for me, was quite magic.
Exactly.
Because there was something about the blackness of the sky and the stars and the image of light in the darkness, seeing the engravings. It was as if it was an upside-down cave.
Exactly.
But at night, mostly. So I don't know how this connects, but it's relevant to my feelings. But talking about portable art, I would like to comment about 2 mysterious objects I came across that I love. Mm-hmm. First, a sperm whale tooth that was found in a deep layer at the entrance of El Castillo cave. And then 2 other sperm whales' teeth found in caves with engraved images. One of a double ibex at Le Mas d'Azil in France, and then one from Las Caldas in Spain, with a bison on one side and actually a whale itself on the other. Mm-hmm. Was this conceptual art?
Well, it depends what you mean by conceptual art, but one of the very common characteristics of portable art of the last Ice Age is drawing a picture of an animal on a piece of that animal. You mentioned the whale tooth from Las Caldas. We have many other examples, such as one of the very first found, 1864, a big piece of mammoth tusk with a mammoth engraved on it in La Madeleine. We have, in northern Spain, many red deer shoulder blades with red deer engraved on. So it is one of the commonest things that they did in the last Ice Age. But whales are an interesting phenomenon. We never really thought about whales in the last Ice Age, actually, until the Las Caldas example was found. We have 2 or 3 depictions of whales, and there's actually one on the wall of Tito Bustillo in cave art as well. And some French specialists just in the last couple of years have started reinvestigating lots of old collections of bone material from caves in France and Spain, and finding there are, in fact, a lot of pieces of whale bone that they were using as tools, because there must have been many whales washed up on the coasts of Spain and France, which they exploited to the best of their ability.
And then sort of made a mythology about, a story.
Well, and the whale is also somehow, between parentheses, a monster. And in Latin, if you take the word monstrum, or to show the sacred, or the abyss, the unknown that comes to surface, I think they must have been quite struck by this presence of a sort of alien.
Absolutely.
And talking of these teeth, they traveled from the shore to the mountains, because these caves are not near the beach or
Our
near the
shells
shore.
did. The shells moved hundreds of
And
miles.
this idea of traveling objects and traveling imagination is also an aspect that we often fly over, but I think it's quite essential
And to transmit knowledge.
Yeah.
But another interesting thing is, people were wearing these shells hundreds of miles from the sources. They took with them their ethnic markers. This is who we are. We're wearing these things on our clothes. If we meet other people, they know about our ancestry. They know something of us. And so perhaps that's why we see things that we don't expect to see, say in the burials, that have come from such a great distance. It may be that they've just exchanged goods, but also researchers are now believing that ethnicity was probably quite important to them. So we know that people from your part of the world, Domingo, some of them came from the Balkans. There is some genetic connection with people in Belgium, but thousands of years earlier. So people were on the move.
I love this idea of connection in vastness and of intimacy in a world without borders, without names,
Absolutely.
without definition, because we are also in the need of imagining a sphere where there is no exact definitions as we do have.
And the universal stories that you were mentioning, the whale, which is a animal for transformation, for being reborn, for Jonas, and so all of these stories that have been inscripted.
Archetypes, we carry them with us, don't we? We carry archetypes with us, we recognize them.
Pinocchio jumps from a cliff with a stone tied at his legs, and he gets eaten by a monster, which is a whale. And in the monster whale, he finds his father, Geppetto. I think it's everything comes back in a way. Dr. Ban, there is a cave you discovered, and there is not many people that discover caves. Actually, the first cave with prehistoric art in Britain. Can you talk about this place? How did you find it? And do you think you will or could find more of this?
Well, I didn't find the cave itself. I found the cave art. But I'd been wanting to look for cave art in Britain for 30 years because I saw no reason why we shouldn't have any. All of the books said there isn't any. But I knew that we had living sites of the period. We even had some bits of portable art already from the last ice age in Britain. And so in 2003, with a couple of colleagues, I decided to make a preliminary look around the most likely sites in Britain. And we knew we wouldn't find paintings because they're pretty visible. Somebody would have spotted them by now. But as I've already mentioned, engravings can be invisible. You have to go looking for engravings with oblique light. And I knew that nobody had yet done that. And that's precisely how we discovered the art in the site is called Creswell Crags. It's the most important collection of living sites of the Ice Age we have in Britain. It's up in the north on the Nottinghamshire-Derbyshire border. In one particular cave called Church Hole, we found a whole series of engravings of animals and also, my pride and joy, a bas-relief of an ibis on the ceiling, which is the only ibis known in Ice Age art. It's the only bas-relief of a bird that we have. And it's extraordinarily beautiful, I think. So, and that's the strange thing. Having wanted to look for cave art in Britain for 30 years, I found it the first morning, which was a bit of an anticlimax, really. But certainly we want to find more. We're sure there must be more. But we've searched every cave in England that we can go into. The problem is some of them, like Kent's Cavern in Torquay, are very wet, covered in calcite. The walls are covered in calcite. We can't see through the calcite. I'm sure it's richly decorated, but until we can see through the calcite, we know from caves in France and in the Urals now that there can be wonderful images hidden under the calcite. And it has to be removed very carefully, but heaven knows how much there is still to be discovered, even in the known caves, where you've got expanses of calcite. There's still a lot of decoration under there that needs to be found. But certainly, yes, I'm hoping we will find more in In Britain, we either need a totally new cave or an unknown chamber in a known cave. But one day we'll get there, I think. Under Church Hole at Creswell Crags, we know there is a cavity underneath Church Hole, but it's filled with sediment. And my gut feeling is there is art in there because there is so much in Church Hole. The problem is that we can't dig it out like they did in the 19th century in a couple of days with pickaxes and shovels. It's going to take several years of painstaking work because, of course, not only do we now dig very, very slowly, but you've got to check the sediments for DNA and all this sort of thing. So it's going to be a very slow and frustrating and painstaking process if we ever raise the funding to get into this new cavity underneath. But my gut feeling is there is more art in there.
We may have lost many decorated caves around the coastline.
Certainly.
Yeah, 300 metres it's gone up since the end of the Ice Age. And we know that, in many places, like in Cantabria and Asturias, they painted in... and we have Cosquer, of course, under the water. That's a decorated cave.
How exciting. Dr. Ban, when we look at Ice Age art, we see such a range of styles and techniques. From different ways of applying pigment and engraving to use of natural rock, surfaces and contours. It makes me wonder how these variations developed. Is it possible, as of today, to identify the different styles of art that emerged during various periods of the Ice Age? And if yes, could you give us perhaps a couple of examples?
Yes, well, it's true. They mastered every technique that they applied in portable art and in cave art and rock art. Their expertise is absolutely astonishing. In terms of styles, of course, yes, we're talking about, again, a whole vast area of Eurasia, but even just in Western Europe, it's a very, very big area, and we're talking about 30,000 years. So inevitably, there are styles that rise and fall. And because we've been studying these things since the late 19th century, we do have a pretty good handle now on the changes of style through time. There are strange things that suddenly arise and then disappear again. For example, in what we call the Gravettian period, about 28,000 years ago, when they draw a mammoth, they draw the tusks coming out of the trunk. Now, they knew the anatomy of mammoths perfectly well, but for some reason, just in the Gravettian, they drew the tusks coming out of the trunk. So that if you find a new cave, as happened with Cusack in the Dordogne in 2000, as soon as you see an engraving of a mammoth with tusks coming out of the trunk, it's Gravettian. And of course it is. Why this happened, we have no idea, but it disappeared again. In later periods of the Ice Age, they drew the mammoths perfectly naturally, anatomically. And another example, which again arose in northern Spain, and only in northern Spain, just for a fairly short period, was the fad of drawing animals in red dot outlines. We used to think this was only in one or two caves, and they're focused around the town of Ramales, so people called it the Ramales School, and they thought it might be just one artist or one little school of artists who did this. And just with this very simple technique of red dots applied with finger and thumb, they conveyed beautiful images of animals with movement and really quite moving images. Covallanas is the main cave known for this, but there are others around. But then just a few years ago, a Spanish specialist wrote his PhD thesis on this technique, and he found it in up to 20 caves all along the North Spanish coast, and all of roughly the same period. Now, we don't think it's the same artist or even the same little school doing this. It just seems to have been a fad that arose. Oh, that's a good idea, we'll do that. And then it disappeared again completely.
There is caves where we can use today's technology to tell that the art there was made by one person only. And there is other caves that have been painting over thousands of years by multiple layers of human hands. When you see the tools, jewelry made from carved animal teeth, shells and stones, and portable art, presumably exchanged between different groups across vast spaces, an undeniable appreciation of aesthetics becomes apparent. Dr. Ban, do you think these were people working as professional artists?
Well, I think if you take any group of people in the last Ice Age, hunter-gatherers, I think most of the people in the group would have been able to knock out a few basic stone tools that they needed. But in every group or in every generation, there will have been somebody who was really, really good at this, maybe even genius level at doing this. And I think they would have been called upon to make tools for many other people. And it's possible that if you have a genius like that at making tools, they could make their living that way. They could travel around Europe, stopping at different tribes and saying, if you feed me and house me for a couple of weeks, I will make all the tools you need. And I think exactly the same thing could apply to artists. You've clearly got artists of genius at times in the last ice age. I'm sure everybody in the group could knock out a basic drawing if they had to, but in every group or in every generation or couple of generations, you will have had people who were really, really good at this. And again, they needed to earn a living. They could have traveled around Europe saying, if you feed me and house me for a couple of weeks, I will decorate your bodies, your clothes, your tents, your tools, your weapons, your rocks, your caves. I can't prove this at all, but to me, it seems self-evident that if you have people with that much talent, A, they need to express themselves for a start, and secondly, they need to earn a living. And that would seem to be an obvious way to earn a living, is use your expertise to survive, to travel around and do as much decorating as people wanted. So I'm sure there were professional artists, however you want to define that, but there's no way to prove it at all.
But in fact, I don't think we're looking for proofs.
No.
It's so beautiful to be in this ambiguity and to open our imagination. But I noticed something specific. In Foshkoa, for example, I noticed that the style of the drawing of the aurochs was exactly parallel to, for example, the axial gallery of Lascaux. Mm-hmm. Some features across hundreds of kilometers that come back also across probably hundreds of years of distance. How can we frame this a little bit, this recurrence of some images and styles across time and space?
Two things, I think, really. One, we know these people moved around over huge distances and were in touch with each other at annual or biannual gatherings or whatever. And secondly, since we know from the open-air art that this stuff was all around them, it was not just hidden away in the depths of caves, then clearly they were open to these influences. It was all around them. And I think this helps to explain how these conventions were passed down through time and through space.
And if it was in a particular convention, then the viewer knew what the artist wanted them to know and understand. It would be the same with Christian art. So a small child knows the stories of Christianity, would immediately be able to recognise the Madonna by what she was wearing, the colours of her clothing. So this is a story, a narrative. It looks like that because it's telling something other than just what it is on the surface. And we see this this is really evident when you go in Courvoisier, which has an image on the wall. There's very little in Courvoisier. It's a very small cave. It was only discovered in the 80s when they were building the road outside. It's in Asturias. And you go in, and it was where bears went to sleep. So you're sitting in a bear hollow, you're looking at the wall, there's a big crack. On one side, there are 4 of these bison. On the other side, there's another one. They're all facing towards the crack. And these are bison in various stages of being. But one of them is absolutely the convention, as you would say. It's like the finished, perfect bison. Underneath is another one with some red splodges, some dots underneath. The same beautiful convention is with the clay bison in Tuc-du-Dubert in the Ariège. It's exactly the same. And it's quite remarkable when you see one, you know, the eye, the way they have it, the little horns, the way they are curled, the beautiful way that they draw the back of the mane, the hump on the back of the bison. Exactly the same clay bison in the Ariège as it is in Asturias, painted on the wall. And we see this throughout, don't we? We see the same. So it has to mean something when it's painted or drawn like that.
It's symbolic meaning.
Symbolic meaning, exactly, Cece.
And there's often discussion about children being inside the caves and possibly creating depictions in places that adults simply couldn't physically reach. And also the idea that children spend time in those spaces, that they were playing and leaving their own marks. In the caves of the French Pyrenees, for example, we find children's footprints and handprints close to the rock art. And Ms. Clifford, I wanted to ask you, how do you interpret their presence? Do you think these children were simply playing and imitating adults, or could some of them have been apprenticed, perhaps even chosen, because of an early talent for carving or painting?
Absolutely. Both, I think, are true. I mean, hunter-gatherers do not leave their children behind. They take them with them everywhere, whatever they're. The children would have gone hunting. I'm sure both boys and girls learned to hunt, even if it became, better for women to child rear rather than go hunting. But I'm sure they learned all of the skills that they needed to survive. And I think children would have gone in from being very young. We know there are infants in caves. We see the footprints. So, yes, they were in there. We know that they made finger marks on the walls, what we call meanderings. Sometimes the adults would have put children on the shoulders so they could reach the ceiling, which is quite strange, really, when children could just run their fingers along, an area where they could stand themselves. But to lift them up, I mean, it's quite an amazing feeling, really, to run your finger along this soft clay. And Rouffignac, the ceilings are covered with these just tracings all over. And as they've built up the amount of this over the years, this would be quite spectacular for future generations to go and visit, to look at and say, this is where your ancestors left their mark. Very emotional experience, going into these amazing caves and, seeing these fabulous images. Because again, if you told a story and it's also an emotional experience, then you remember it better. If it's an emotional experience, the message gets handed on.
In fact, Cecilia was mentioning elephants before, talking of emotions and of connection. And we see in the loving depiction of animals in caves how they were observed, probably as teachers of behavior regarding caring and hunting. Was caregiving a shared communal activity?
It certainly is in hunter-gatherers. You have often, I think this is more the convention where women stay with women, because in hunter-gatherers, all women can usually lactate when there's a young baby around, which is quite amazing. Even postmenopausal women can start lactating if there's a baby that needs feeding. It would have been a good survival, for women to stay together, but men would have been just as good caregivers. Hunter-gatherer men, very good fathers, and often think of all the children we don't know how much they knew about conception and whose children were whose. Well, obviously you know who the mother is, but you don't always know who the father is. They may have figured this out. They figured all sorts of things out, but they would have felt responsible for all of these children and a duty to all of these children.
Hi, we would love to hear your comments and learn about what you see. Share your input at www.ccpodcast.com and follow us on social media. Oh, I almost forgot. To accompany us in this season's journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And now let's continue with Cici.
What do the burials of children that have been found tell us about these societies? And how about the double burial at the Romito Cave in Calabria, very close to where I spent all my childhood summertime?
Oh, look at you. They tell us a lot, but then we have to be very cautious because we only have about a dozen child burials, deliberate child burials. It's hard to really infer a huge amount other than how remarkable they actually are. And sometimes they're very complicated and other times they're quite simple. A simple little burial at Wilczyce in Poland with just a child found in an ice wedge with the faunal remains. It wasn't even a child, it was about 38 weeks, so it's a newborn. However, there was about 100 and so little fox teeth that must have been a necklace, either the mother's necklace or a charm that the child had. And we know from hunter-gatherers charms are quite important in their sort of ontology. And if something happens to the person, then that charm hasn't worked. So it's disposed of with them because it's no use anymore. And that may be it. Or it may just be that the mother wanted to keep a connection. This is mine, this is what I wear, and I'll leave this with you. So that's a very simple burial. But there are also very, very complicated burials as well. Some of the Gravettian burials, and many of them are in Italy, the grave goods, it's hard to figure out what on earth. You see traditions, but then you see different things. Fox teeth and Animal teeth are very common, but they're probably worn as jewellery. But that's not to say the dozen or so that we've got haven't been incredibly informative, especially if you can get some really good quality DNA from the bones. And this is happening now, so we're learning so much. I'll give you one example. One of the earliest child burials was in Austria, the Krems monozygotic twins, the first example we have of a twin birth. Might not have been the first, but there wouldn't have been many when you think of population numbers, monozygotic, 2 boys. And this must have been absolutely amazing for the mother and the community. 2 babies born at the same time. Unfortunately, one died very soon after birth, the other one 6 or 7 weeks later, but they were buried in a shallow oval pit. Convention was to put ochre at the bottom of the pit, which can act as a sort of a preservative so that, the bodies don't putrefy as quickly. And both infants, so one died immediately, was placed in this, and a mammoth scapula was put over the top. The mother may have suspected that the second infant wasn't going to do that well, and that's why she left space, or the community left space there. The second infant died, and that was placed with it, the scapula on top. Again, very simple grave goods, some teeth and some shells. But we also know now that because of the science work that's been done recently, is that she attempted to breastfeed both infants because of what was found in the teeth. Barium was found in the teeth, and this is like the breastfeeding signal. I mean, it's the archaeologists and the researchers that found these said it was like winning the lottery. But this is just the beginning of what we're going to find out. And we're going to find out, where people came from, how long it took to get there. Just watch this space, because what the scientists are going to be able to tell us, if they can get enough, good ancient DNA, if it's of good quality, they can find out an enormous amount. So yes, isn't it interesting? Another young individual that was different. As most of these burials, there's something about them that is different. So it was a double burial, yes, an older woman that was with him, not related, and she was quite small too. But Ramito, as he's known, he was an achondroplastic dwarf, and he had shortened limbs, and he would have had very limited mobility. His femurs were bowed, so he would have difficulty walking, no rotation of the arms, so he wouldn't have been taken hunting, but that's not to say he couldn't have been useful to the community. I don't think there would have been any backsliders in the Ice Age. They looked after people. We know that disabled people were cared for. We know about him. He could have been a childminder in the group. So yes, it's very interesting. But again, here's a burial that was staged. These bodies were intertwined. She had her arm round him. He had his head on her cheek, and they must have been buried together for some reason. We don't know how he died. He was probably 18, 20 years of age. But certainly, life for him would have been extremely difficult for, people that were mobile. Probably had to be carried or dragged on a sled or something like that. But he managed to live till he was 20.
And Domingo, in Futuro Remoto, a series of photographs that you presented at the 2024 Venice Biennale, you recount a moment that made you feel suspended outside of linear time. As the building began to flood, the sensation of water flowing beneath your feet transported you back to Salento, the southernmost tip of Puglia, where you were born, and the time overlapped. Among the crowd was a blue-eyed child who referred to the Venus of Oroco figure carved in stone and representing a woman, also known as the Mother of Life, a goddess related to the Mother of Death, too, found in the cave in Paravita, Salento, the place of birth of your grandfather. His blue eyes, you described, glazed over, making it feel as if time had stood still and transported you to your memories back in time. He, Giancarlo, your grandfather, also had eyes as blue as the sea, just like that child.
Isn't it interesting? I think there was a boy, the Moora boy, that was found near your Bari, your home place in Monopoly. Is that far away from you?
It's where my grandmother comes from.
He was found in a rock shelter, a young boy about 2 to 4 years of age. 17,000 years ago he died, and they know that he had dark skin, blue eyes, very tight curly brown hair, and he died of a congenital heart problem, and his parents were first cousins.
I love this. Thank you.
When we look at the archaeological record, we find these small Ice Age artifacts, miniature tools, little carvings, or playful markings. And that suggests children were already learning and experimenting through play, of course. But it's often difficult to tell, as you were saying, whether the marks we see on bones or stones are intentional, aesthetic, or symbolic. Henri Martin was among the first to scientifically approach prehistoric bone art working at a time where this was very challenging. Today, new technologies and experimental archaeology have opened new horizons for understanding these non-utilitarian marks. From your perspective as a psychologist who studies prehistoric behavior, Ms. Clifford, how do you think play influenced the development of imagination and symbolic thought that we've been talking a lot about in early humans?
Essential, absolutely essential. I mean, we evolved to play, like a lot of other species have evolved to play. You see all sorts of animals playing together when they're learning about their environment, they're testing their environment. And certainly these children would have been encouraged to play together, play games that often were pretend games about the adult things that they had to learn to do. We see this all the time with, hunter-gatherer groups. They are mimicking the sorts of things they will need to do in adulthood. And yes, we see in the burial in Sangir, I think there were 9 little miniature lances. They wouldn't have been usable, but children certainly would have been able to play with them. And another interesting little thing, this was in a burial in Siberia, was a tiny little shovel. There's a little mammoth shovel that a child has. And, there's some burials in Malta Barrett up in near Lake Baikal, and there are lots and lots of interesting are they toys, are they playthings, little figurines. Remember, they could have been used for all sorts of purposes for children to learn and to play with.
The late sociologist Robert Bellah is considered one of the most influential theorists of religion in the 20th and the early 21st centuries. He's best known for his work on religion, culture, moral evolution, and the role of symbolic systems in human societies. Up next, we will hear an excerpt on Bellah's insight into why play is fundamental to who we are.
According to the late great sociologist Robert Bellah, play is not mere pastime. It is the cradle of imagination, ritual, and symbolism. He argues that through play, humans first create the space in which myths, art, music, religion, and dance can emerge. Ritual, in Bellah's view, is essentially serious play, the primordial form of human symbolic activity. From an evolutionary perspective, play gave early humans flexibility, cooperation, and a capacity for symbolic thought, traits that allowed culture to emerge. It is through this symbolic play that we began to inhabit multiple layers of reality: the everyday, the ritual, the mythic, the sacred. For Bellah, then, symbolic culture did not spring up fully formed. It was born in the world of play, where boundaries blur, ordinary tales are suspended, and human beings learn to transcend the mundane. That suspension of ordinary reality, enabled by play and imagination, is the foundation of everything from religion and ritual to art and shared cultural identity. So, Bellah sees play not as frivolous distraction, but as the root, the cultural ground zero from which our capacity for myth, symbol, ritual, and ultimately religion arises.
And following Robert Bellah's ideas, could play, Miss Clifford, especially shared creative play, have helped form an early sense of collective consciousness or shared meaning within those Ice Age communities.
Yes, for sure. I'm sure it would, yes. It's vital that these people all shared a reality.
Speaking about this collective consciousness, despite their differences in time and space, I always feel that all cave art is connected, as if the artistic expressions were a sort of mental mapping, or we could say manifestation of a form of unity. Dr. Ban, how would you explain the way people mentally constructed their environment through art? Or how might this visual manifestation have helped them organize knowledge, remember geography, or even tell stories about their world, ancestors, cosmologies, space, time?
There was a recent paper published by most of them leading specialists in Australian rock art recently, and they'd all asked their Aboriginal informants similar questions, which is rock art important to you and should it be preserved? And all of them said exactly the same thing, which is, yes, it is extremely important to us because it is our equivalent of your Bibles, atlases, history books, storybooks, everything. Apart from oral transmission, it is our only way of recording and transmitting all of this crucial information. And I think it was exactly the same in the last Ice Age. It was their main means, other than oral transmission, of putting things down for future generations to learn from. Now, and of course, what information they got from the art will have depended on their sex, their age, their degree of initiation, and it probably changed through their lifetimes and certainly through the generations. But it is, the key way that they had in the Ice Age of recording and transmitting information.
The internet.
Yes.
So, Dr. Ban, just to wrap up, all of these different expressions of art, we can think of saying that they had three aims: decorate, transmit knowledge, and of course, the spiritual.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And the images we see in Lascaux and Altamira are so sophisticated and immensely beautiful, as you've been all describing. And we were already talking about how our ancestors used light and the natural shapes and silhouettes of the cave to portray animals, the paintings, engravings, and forms. And I was thinking that to do that, you'd first be able to imagine those shapes. And what's fascinating about these engravings, ornamentations, and Brock art is that they truly seem to mark a mental leap, a shift beyond simple survival toward imagination and abstraction. In your book, Dr. Ban, co-author with Michel Lorblanchet, The First Artists is the name of the book. You talk about how the first dots appeared and then turned into lines, and how from seeing shadows and discovering images within them, the first carvings were transported from the imaginary to the cave walls or to the open air. I think it's out of this abstraction that figurative art is born. And Dr. Ban, which were the first artistic expressions detached from the immediate needs of survival that we can identify, and how far back can we trace them? How old are these first signs of imagination?
The first trace of imagination, I would say, is a pebble from Makapansgat in South Africa, which an Australopithecine picked up. It wasn't modified in any way. It's completely natural, but it looks exactly like a human face. And they brought it a big distance into the living site. So for many people, that is the first trace we have of some kind of aesthetic awareness. They saw a face in this pebble and it meant something to them, and they brought it back to their living site. But in terms of actually producing marks, the earliest we have go back to Homo erectus. We have a shell in Java with some lines engraved. And in the Golan Heights, we have a tiny little figurine, which is clearly carved by humans. Looks like a little female figurine. So we're talking a few 100,000 years ago.
Amazing.
Yes. So these are the earliest. There will be many more, I'm sure, to come, because I'm sure a lot of people have failed to recognize things in old collections and so on. There are probably many more examples to come, but certainly Homo erectus. There are some bones in Germany at Bilzingsleben also, which seem to be totally non-functional. They're not butchering, engraving cuts on bones. They seem to have been making patterns on bones. Mm-hmm. So again, Homo erectus. And then, of course, once we get into the Neanderthals, you really start getting an avalanche of stuff now. For most of the 20th century, most scholars said, oh, Neanderthals were just like animals. They had no culture, they had no art. Now it's gone completely the other way. We're finding more and more evidence that Neanderthals were extremely artistic in many ways. They have kilos of pigment in their sites, so they were probably doing body painting. Mm-hmm. We now know they were marking cave walls in different ways. They were making jewelry, all kinds of bling. And we even have a proto-sculpture from Franz La Roche-Cotard, this flint. It looks like a flint face with a bone thrust through it, so it looks like a flint face with two bone eyes. It's extraordinary, and it's about 70,000 years old. So Neanderthals were most definitely producing art. And we have a whole number of caves in Spain now where the dating shows that most definitely, including the Altamira ceiling, where the earliest things put on the Altamira ceiling are red geometric marks, and the dating of the calcite on them shows they are at least 35,000 years old and probably much more.
And that ceiling is just amazing. There's a photograph of you, Domingo, from that ceiling, and it's just magical. And well, when we think about the images of Lascaux and again Chauvet, which I just know from seeing them in the books, not as you, Miss Clifford, or of course Dr. Ben and Domingo, I think about how this imaginary can project an idea. And we were talking about these finger dots turn into lines and then the lines into form recognizable in the natural shapes of the rock. Then having that expression of the mind, how it gains shared symbolic meaning among humans, how it can be later expressed in a codified manner, as you were mentioning, that you could relate to that meaning just by seeing it. And the techniques that we were talking about also. I mean, it doesn't get more sophisticated than that. And Dr. Ben, are we talking here about the creative spirit embedded in the mind? Is this the spark of the evolution of consciousness? In other words, did the emergence of symbolic art reflect the awakening of the human mind?
I think you could certainly argue that for sure, yes, because it comes out of nothing. It was triggered by a whole number of things, probably fossils also. Fossils will have given them a lot of good ideas about shapes and intriguing things. What on earth is this? So, yes, they were triggered by a whole number of things, and slowly it developed into more and more complex depictions and more naturalistic depictions. So, yes, I think you could certainly argue that.
Something resonated with me when I read it a long, long time ago, and it was, I'll just read it out. Great artists are searching for inventions in their minds and forming perfect ideas. Then with their hands, they express what they had previously conceived with their intellect. And that was Leonardo da Vinci explaining to his patron, the Duke of Milan, trying to explain how this image that he produced, where did it actually come from?
You know, there's this book of Desmond Morris called The Artistic Ape, 3 Million Years of Art. And I think that brilliantly portrays the unfolding of faces with child art, providing a very helpful guide to the development of visual language. And what I would also like to bring about, now that we talk about imagination, is a clip of former President Emerita of PEN International and poet Jennifer Clement on what she says about the power of imagination.
The thing about the imagination that's so important, it's where all discovery happens. So, you're not going to go to the moon unless you imagine that you can go to the moon. I mean, without imagination, there's no discovery. It's a very important part of what it means to be human.
And archaeology tells us a lot about the evolution of human consciousness. But how do archaeologists actually reconstruct consciousness from fragments? We only have traces, objects, marking bones, and of course, we bring our own cognitive bias when we interpret the thoughts of ancient people. What's your recommendation, Ms. Clifford, on how to approach this carefully?
Well, thoughts don't fossilize, and so we have to make inferences. I've never looked for the meaning of any art. I have thought it's safer to look for its purpose. So what is the person that's making the art or making the object, what is the purpose of it? We focus on the archaeology and more what we can see, but I don't think it's our approach looking at, what was going on in people's consciousness, because
Of course.
it doesn't fossilize. And what we can do to some extent is work in the other direction. So we are the blueprint. We are humans. We know what it's like to be human. So we can say that certain behaviors and traits go all the way back to our earliest ancestors, way back before the Ice Age, back 100,000 years, 150,000 years. We don't really know.
In many prehistoric caves, key images were placed deep inside, hidden in the earth's belly. At La Pasiega, for example, geometric patterns appear where the cave ends, as if marking a final threshold where we cannot proceed farther. In Altamira, at the deepest wall, back down, black markings form hybrid faces that seem to watch you as you turn back toward the light. Echoes of these mysteries are also found in the shaft at Lascaux, with the Hithyphallic birdman and the dying bison, or in front of the ambiguous hybrid figure of the lion, vulva, bison, man on the rock pendant in the depth of the Chauvet cave. Dr. Ban, what do you think the depth and remoteness of these cave chambers tell us about their ritual purpose?
There's a number of things to say about this. One is a personal experience I had in the cave of Fond de Gaume many years ago. I was visiting it with John Pfeiffer, an American writer, and the then head guide of Fond de Gaume. And she gave us a complete tour of the cave. And at the end of it, I confided to John that there had been a part of the cave, which is not on the tourist trail these days, that I felt very, very uncomfortable in. I did not like being in that space, and I wanted to get out of it. And John said he'd felt exactly the same thing in that space, and the head guide told us she also felt exactly the same. And I've spoken about this to many speleologists over the years, and they do confirm that in many caves, there are places where you feel happy and comfortable and you're delighted to be there. And on the other hand, there are parts of the caves you do not want to be in. It's called the non-empirical environment. And I'm quite sure things like that occurred also in the last Ice Age. It may explain why parts of these caves were not decorated. In terms of why they place things in certain parts of the caves, I looked into this some years ago. I was trying to find some kind of ethnographic help, but there are not many cultures in world history that have decorated deep caves. The Cubans did it a lot. There are one or two in America, there are one or two in Australia, but we know nothing about these people. The one ancient culture that did habitually decorate deep caves, and we know a lot about them, is the Maya. And of course, they were only a few centuries ago. There are lots of Maya still around. We have their writings. We have the writings of the conquistadors and the missionaries and so on. But one of the fundamental thoughts of the Maya in relation to caves is that the cave is a completely different world. And the further underground you go, the more sacred and the more special the space becomes. And I think we could legitimately apply that to the last Ice Age. And one example of that would be the clay bison of the Tuc d'Audubert that we've already mentioned, which are at the very far end of that cave. They could go no further. They went as far into that cave as they could. They left the images there, and then they came out, and they never went back. And we know that because of the footprints. So there is some kind of power, some force sending them into the most difficult, the furthest parts of the caves, because the Tuc is a difficult cave with clambering and crawling and so on to get to the far end. They took small children in with them. But the ultimate example I would give you is a cave in France, not very well known, called Père Gouzet, which Michel Lorblanchet, who is the greatest scholar we have of cave art, he spent 10 long years suffering, studying this cave, Père Gouzet. Père Gouzet originally had a big entrance chamber, but they built a road and destroyed that. So the entrance of Père Gouzet is now what used to be a hole at the back of that entrance chamber. So you have this little hole at the side of the road. You go into that. You then have 150 meters of crawling flat out, pulling with your fingers and toes through wet mud. And of course, we have lights on our forehead now. The Ice Age people were carrying a lamp and doing this 150 meters. It's horrible. And at the end of the 150 meters, then you can stand up. And then they started decorating the cave, and there are some beautiful engraving. But the extraordinary discovery that Michel made was that in the decorated chamber, there is a little niche in the wall, and he couldn't get his head inside. It's too small, but he thought there was something in there. So he inserted a camera, took a picture, and sure enough, there is an engraving in there of, we think it's a horse head. Now, even that artist never saw that image. It was done by touch. The artist reached into that and engraved it by touch. So it was never, ever meant for anybody else to see. It's the ultimate in private art. And this is the thing, some of the cave art is clearly on view. It's meant for the public or whoever was allowed to see it. But a certain amount of it is so hidden and so secret. It has to be spiritual. It has to be religious in some way, whether it's an offering to a god or a spirit or an ancestor or a thank you or whatever. But that is the ultimate, whether even the artist, him or herself, never saw that image.
This intimacy, what you were talking about at the beginning that we've heard, Domingo. And just very briefly, could the figures often described as shamans reflect early attempts to bridge the human and animal worlds? Not through psychedelics, I believe, because of the weather and the cold climates. I don't believe that there were a lot of psychedelics, but I'm not an expert. Would these figures be these bridges that through close observation and connection would lead to bridge humans and animal worlds, seeing and learning from how animals hunted and helped one another and survived?
No, I think they understood the animal world so intimately. They didn't need to do this. They didn't need to.
They didn't need a shaman.
No. They were all shamans, if you like. They were all intimately knowledgeable. They knew every animal, how every animal would have seen other animals. Human beings would have tapped into every bit of that. They would have known the world of the ant, the insect, and watched animals with other animals and how they behave together. They would have taken all of that in. That would have been part of their messages. These therianthropes that you talk about, there's maybe about 5 of them, which are a compilation of various animals. They look sort of part human, antlers, they have, also. This is another metaphor for getting a message over to other people. No less exciting, I think, than the idea of shamans. It's no less. That had to spring from someone's mind, his imagination. It's like, what Leonardo said. This idea had to spring from someone's mind, and he wanted to get that idea into other people's minds and describe what he's talking about. And the best way he can do that is painting it and engraving it on the wall and then bringing everyone in. I've seen this more than once, I think. It's quite remarkable. It's high up, but the area that you're in the cave is perfect for having an audience.
I think this really connects with the idea of the supernatural and the natural being merged in the vision of our ancestors without making these differences. This merging of worlds, performance, and ritual, the natural, and as I've said, the supernatural, seems to travel with us through time. As an example, let's move forward some 15,000 years into ancient Greece, where we will hear how these same threads continue. In the next excerpt, we draw on the insight of 2 remarkable voices, Anthony and Isabel Robitschek, professor at Stanford University, Richard Martin, one of the world's leading authorities on Greek mythology, and also Philip Matiszak, acclaimed historian and author celebrated for bringing the ancient world vividly to life through his masterfully storytelling and sharp historical insight.
Performance, I think, is a really important term, and it does cover ritual. It covers oratory. It covers the sort of thing you would say in the assembly in Athens. All of these are, to use a term that I use to define myths sometimes, authoritative utterances. They're things done by people who have some sort of knowledge or power in front of audiences. Those are the key factors. When you come to drama specifically, this is under the realm of a particular god, and it seems to develop, as Aristotle already pointed out, from festivals connected to Dionysus, the god of wine and growth. He's also the god of ecstasy, and literally, ecstasy is ekstasis, standing outside yourself. So when you put on a mask and you become another character in Greek drama, that's a form literally of standing outside yourself. And it seems that performances of all sorts provide cultures with this imaginative space where you can become an other or the other. And the unresolved question is still being debated every year is to what extent, when Greeks went to, say, the latest tragedy by Sophocles, they were involved in a religious event. Was it like a liturgy? Was it like a mass? Or was it pure entertainment? So we keep circling back to this paradox that for us, entertainment and religion are opposite sides of the spectrum. For them, they're one thing.
We tend to see humans and nature as two different things. We see the natural and the supernatural as different things. To the Greeks of the ancient world, these were all integrated. The natural was the supernatural because, let's face it, there was no other way to explain things. Religion was very much a part of everyday life. Everything you did had a religious aspect.
Speaking of the merging of worlds and spirituality, Dr. Ban, I'd like to share a question that a listener of our podcast left for you.
My name is Kunjan, and I have a question for Professor Ben. I'm originally from Nepal, and my roots are Tibetan, so I practice Tibetan Buddhism. In my culture, we do a spiritual, let's say, practice that people spend months isolated on the caves to get deeper onto their spirituality. So I wanted to know, in the ice cage times, how often were humans practicing their spirituality? So like breathing exercise, meditation, prayers. So I really want to understand what was happening back then. I'm sure there's a correlation between the spirituality and the mind and the body, even at that age. So I look forward to hearing.
Well, of course, the short answer is we have absolutely no idea, but I would say that we know very much from hunter-gatherer societies that two things that are of huge importance to them are silence and patience, because you need that when you're out hunting game and so on. And of course, as we've already said, the caves are such a bizarre environment. They're a totally different world. They would certainly, I think, have induced feelings of meditation and just sitting in there and gazing and thinking. Similarly, as we've already talked about, sitting around a fire. Fires can be, almost hallucinatory. They're fascinating things. You sit and meditate and ponder. So we know they had fire. We know they must have sat around fires. We know they had the caves. They definitely needed to silence and patience. So it's perfectly possible that they did meditate in some ways. Whether or not in the caves, we have no idea. But
this was part of their everyday life.
Absolutely.
Everyday, right?
Well, yes. I mean, the Inuit have a word for long patience, which is waiting for hours, but your head isn't empty. You are in tune with the landscape. So it's almost like you're awake with your eyes open. So it's a different state to the one that we normally go about our lives. And another interesting thing is I take part in a meditative group, the Sam Harris meditation, and people post online which is their favourite place for meditating. And the vast majority of people pick somewhere in the landscape, which I think is incredibly interesting. And again, in the 1980s, psychologists did a big experiment where they asked people what was their favourite picture to look at, and guess what? It was landscapes. And I think that tells us something about what it is to be human, because looking at landscapes takes up such a great proportion of our ancestry. I mean, just the Ice Age, it's 1,200 generations of people looking at the landscape. And we go back even further than that. So landscape triggers something in us that is enormously pleasurable and peaceful.
Being merged
and
with
being
nature.
merged, exactly, yes.
And this connection to landscape and nature, let's hear ecologist Carl Safina, inaugural endowed professor for nature and humanity at Stony Brook University and founder of the Safina Center.
Let me just say, it works for me. If I was only reading the news, if I was only going to work in a building, I would be a pretty unhappy person. But I do think that my life is balanced in a really beautiful way, just because there are birds in the backyard. Just to go for a walk on the beach with the dogs and see these animals really makes me feel really connected to the rest of the world and also to the history of life on Earth. Just thinking these animals have been here for many thousands of years. The island that I live on, Long Island, outside of New York, has been here for about 20,000 years. It's not very long in the history of life on Earth. It's part of the glacial history of North America from the last ice ages, because the island was pushed by the ice sheets. It's just a bunch of sand and gravel that makes this island, which is 120 miles long. And all of this connects me. You know, before I read any bad news or before I have to work on something that is distressing, I have a little bit of beauty in the day, and that is a necessary balance to keep me sane. Sometimes I say, try to stay reasonably well and unreasonably sane in these times and what's going on right now in this very distressing world that we're in.
Dr. Ben, archaeological evidence shows that music, from bone flutes to rhythmic percussion and the acoustics of deep caves, developed alongside early art and ritual. How do you see the creation of music as linked to the growth of imagination and altered states of consciousness in early humans? And could music have served as a bridge between the sensory world and the symbolic or spiritual one?
I'm sure music was extremely important to them. I think humanity's first exposure to music must have been birdsong. It was surrounded by birdsong, and even today, many of us are enchanted by listening to birds. A lot of people found that during lockdown. They would go into their gardens and suddenly rediscover the music of birds. So that must have triggered ideas in them, and then eventually they developed, a lot of the early flutes were made from bird bones, so there's a connection there, I think. They were able to make sounds of their own, and of course, lithophones is the main one we know of from the caves. And we know they played the lithophones because some of them are bashed. One in Nerja is marked with red and black signs. So, and when you're in a cave and you hear a lithophone played, it's a very gentle, it's a almost hallucinatory noise to hear this echoing around the cave, when the acoustics, of course, in some of the caves are extraordinary. And if you have, it's like a marimba being played. If you hear that echoing around, it could have caused all kinds of experiences for them. And in Neo, of course, Neo and Kandama were the two caves, decorated caves, with the most phenomenal acoustics, which they must have made use of. So yes, I think the music certainly would have been a very important part of it. We can't prove it, but singing, chanting, having sing-songs around the fire of an evening.
Exactly. Well, I would like to finish with the answer of B.J. Ayer of whether he could imagine music to be present in those caves.
And when I think about what was that world like in that cave, what did it sound like? And what do we call that sound? And where was music? How could it have not been there? What would it mean to say that those people didn't have music? What would we be claiming about those people that we will never meet or know anything about except this, that they gathered in a cave and made things together? Did they sing? How could they not? Did they share sound as they shared food? How could they not? When we ask, why did people make music together? What if we ask instead, how could they not?
Well, we come to the end of this fantastic episode. Thank you, Domingo, for not only nurturing this conversation with your personal experience in the caves, but also for pouring your mind and soul into this interview. And of course, my gratitude to our extraordinary guests, Ms. Elle Clifford and Dr. Ben, for traveling all the way from the UK to Berlin to share an illuminating dialogue, one that allowed us to momentarily suspend time and space and to see the people of the Ice Age reflected in our own human nature and in the ways we express awareness and consciousness. Those first artistic expressions, carved and painted thousands of years ago, reveal an inner voice, a leap into abstraction that marks the beginning of transcendence. Thank you all for this remarkable exchange and for helping us open the very first door in our exploration of the human mind.
Thank you for inviting us.
It was a pleasure.
A real pleasure.
I'm not sure we talked only about the deep past. I think we also talked about the future somehow. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our listeners, wherever you are, for having allowed us to share time with you. Remember, Everyday Life in the Ice Age and a children's version of this book, published by Archaeo Press, are both available in English, Spanish, and French languages. They're easy to find in the internet and are, of course, available in your nearby bookshop. Should you wish to learn more about Dr. Ben's writings, books, findings, research, and lecturing on archaeological study tours, please check the contact information we have included in this episode's description. Thank you, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.